dramatically with a nod of encouragement, before she finally exited. "I can't have Carlisle take it to him." Esme finally spoke. I met her gaze again, biting a smile as I took the stool in front of her. Because that wasn't good enough for me, and I was ready to fight for this one thing. This one little, tiny gesture. To give my boyfriend a cake on his birthday. Esme must have seen the silent defiance in my eyes as she worked to shift the subject away from the blue cake/pink elephant between us. "Are you speaking to me now?" she asked quietly, almost sadly, as she folded her hands on the dark granite. I decided to humor her into thinking that argument was over. "Yes," I concluded with a minor nod of emphasis. Her expression softened, and she smiled widely, lighting up her face, and making me realize how much I had missed speaking to her. "That makes me endlessly happy, Bella," she smiled, reaching a hand around the cake to pat mine. I began feeling uncomfortable with the direction of this conversation. She was being nice to me, sweet even, and I needed to retain my anger with her. I needed to fight harder. "I want to take the cake too, Edward," I demanded, pulling my hand out from under hers, possibly a little childishly, but I didn't care. Her face fell, as she withdrew her hand, and frowned at the cake. "You know the rules, Bella," she whispered curtly, her face hardening in a rare show of authority, as she lifted her own chin. "I don't want you around that boy." Her voice seeped with a little less disgust than the morning of Sleepgate, but not nearly enough to placate me. I lifted my chin higher and narrowed my eyes. "His name is Edward." I nearly sneered at her, being at my wit's end with her insulting tone. Her nostrils flared slightly, and she simply shook her head sharply, denying my request once again. I groaned in frustration, throwing my hands in the air. "What harm could it cause, Esme?" I asked in exasperation. Seriously, it wasn't like he would maul me for simply bringing him a cake. She huffed and her brows furrowed. "You know, most children would be grounded for that little 3-month-long stunt you pulled," was her clipped reply. I gaped at her, realizing the non-punishments weren't so much non-punishments as much as real punishments, and hating the whole concept of punishment impossibly more. She seemed to have come to the same realization at that precise moment as her face fell, and she bowed her head in something that seemed like shame. "You know I don't mean to punish you, Bella," she whispered while fiddling with her fingers. But I really didn't know that. And I doubted Esme believed her own statements either. She had been so busy convincing herself this was all for my own good, she hadn't even realized she had taken away so much more than my boyfriend. She took away my kitchen at night, and even my freedom on the weekends. I was, essentially, grounded. When she met my gaze again, she had a frown on her face. "I got a call from the school yesterday." She tilted her head at me as her frown deepened. I stiffened in my stool, flipping through the dim recesses of my memory to determine if I had fallen asleep in class again. But I knew I hadn't, so I furrowed my eyebrows at her questioningly. She cleared her throat and got that familiar look of concern on her face she had been giving me for the last 2 weeks. "You're not paying attention, and your grades are slipping," she informed me, squinting her eyes as she appeared to be inspecting my face very closely. I shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny of her gaze as my stare fell to my lap. "I'll do better," I promised in a whisper while biting my lip in uncertainty. Because I had been trying my very best to keep up, and it still wasn't enough. Esme sighed, but it came out more like a strangled moan. "No," she spoke weakly, and then repeated it once again louder, and once again in a strong and sharp tone, that made me flinch as I cautiously met her gaze again. Her eyebrows furrowed in annoyance as she stared at me. "You are downright debilitated with exhaustion, Bella," she nearly growled at me, which was a tone I had never heard Esme take with anyone. I figured this was probably the pink elephant in the room. If I were being honest with myself, this had been the pink elephant in this entire house ever since Sleepgate. I simply shook my head, refusing to admit just how true that statement likely was. This just made her impossibly more agitated as she stood from her stool and leaned over the cake, grabbing my chin in her hand and forcing me to lock gazes with her. She leaned even closer to my face, inspecting me shamelessly while she held my chin.
"You aren't sleeping at all, are you?"
she asked in a tone that clearly suggested she already knew the answer. I gulped, staring into her eyes as my brain warred with itself over how to proceed with this conversation. One half of me was certain if I just told her, explained that I couldn't do it without Edward, she would understand. And maybe then, she would allow us to resume our routine. Maybe under supervision, or in my own bedroom, it didn't really matter to me. But the other half of me knew, there was no possible way for her to reconcile the line between what Edward and I needed for sleep, and what we desired for our romantic relationship. That line was already blurry enough, and I found it hard to distinguish that line myself most days. My face collapsed under her gaze, and my shoulder hunched inward as I realized I was too tired. Tired of making excuses, and tired of lying about being tired. "I can't sleep without Edward," I admitted nervously, in just a barely there whisper, and half of me hoped she didn't hear. The half that knew the line wasn't clear enough. As me huffed and released my chin gently, dropping back down onto her stool with a different expression of frustration etched on her face.
"Is this your method of rebellion?"
she asked skeptically while my fingers began instinctively pulling at my sweater sleeves on the cold granite.
"To stay awake so long that I'll be forced to cave in?"
she added. I frowned. I should have seen that coming. I shook my head, while I sighed deeply in defeat. It was going to be all, or nothing. I had kept so much from Esme, since I moved here. She had my doctor's notes and references, but she didn't really know. I preferred to keep her in the dark about the severity, because I didn't want to pull her into that darkness with me. I could only hope my honesty would force some kind of rational thought into her brain. So, with another stealing breath, my mouth opened, and it all spilled forth. I spent 10 minutes telling her all about my nightmares, dreams, memories, whatever. She remained perfectly still, and kept a deceivingly blank expression, while I relayed the tale of the closet dreams, and watched her eyes flicker in recognition. Likely because she had been questioning the wardrobe ever since Edward had moved it for me to obscure the closet. I watched her put the pieces together slowly, realizing how long this had been occurring, and how modest I had already been in relation to my problems, downplaying them for her benefit. And once I could no longer talk about the memories in a calm and collected voice, I began telling her about Edward, and how I could sleep with him in his arms alone. I briefly tried explaining the electricity, but hastily skirted around that, because it felt too personal. Instead, I simply told her how he made me feel safe. By the time I had finished, her eyes were wider and her face was paler. I sucked my bottom lip into my mouth, chewing it anxiously while she processed my words and turned them over in her head. We sat in a tense silence for many moments, before her expression swiftly transformed into anger. Unbridled fury flashed in her dark brown eyes as her fists clenched on the dark granite. "You kept this from me?" she asked in a low voice, which was calm, but injected with a very obvious anger nonetheless.
"It's my place to help you with these things, Bella."
Her voice shook and I could do nothing but stare at her anxiously.
"Not Edward Cullen's,"
she concluded curtly. I didn't say anything as my feet swayed lightly beneath me from the stool. What could I say? I didn't want her help. The truth was, there was nothing she could do for me. Why bother her with a problem she had no chance of solving? Esme thought differently.
"I'm making an appointment with the psychologist."
She spoke decisively as my face now paled, and my head shook furiously. I didn't want it, and I wouldn't do it. She couldn't make me. Her face became desperate, as she roughly grabbed my hand from the countertop and enveloped it in both of hers firmly.
"Please, do it for me," she pleaded, nearly begging as my head continued shaking, and she held my hand tighter. Just as swiftly as anger overcame her before, her head fell in a long and agonized sigh of something that sounded a whole lot like defeat. I suddenly decided this could be used to my advantage.
I had felt utter defeat and desperation before. "If you'll let me see Edward," I bartered cunningly, fighting both a smile and a grimace at my genius. It was such an enormous compromise on my part. She had to see that, and meet me halfway if she really wanted this. I grew more excited as her head lifted, and her eyes began shifting the room in contemplation of my offer. I waited with a bated breath as she chewed the inside of her cheek, and made her decision. When her eyes met mine once again, the glimmer of hope inside of my chest fizzled, and died with the smile that was awaiting her approval.
"I'm sorry, but I can't agree to that,"
she whispered, declining the compromise with a sigh, and looking away from my crushed gaze. I withdrew my hand dejectedly as my shoulders fell. "Why?" I asked incredulously. She had been trying to lure me into therapy ever since I moved to Forks. It just didn't measure up. "Do you really hate him so much?" There was no other explanation, and I couldn't fathom how her hatred for Edward could possibly be stronger than her desire for my mental health.
"I don't hate Edward,"
she insisted, shaking her head vehemently.
"I just don't trust Edward,"
she clarified with pleading eyes. She kept her hand lingering precariously on the counter beside the cake, and I could see it twitching. "Calm up. He'd never hurt me." I wanted to pound it into her brain. I really shouldn't have had to. She had seen him with me that day in the gym, and it should have been proof enough that he cared too much to ever harm me.
"There's more than one way to hurt someone, Bella,"
she sighed in something that sounded like exasperation. Her hand remained on the counter as her eyes darkened.
"You've had physical pain beyond what I can even comprehend. You had emotional pain from losing your mother."
Her voice became strained, her face contorting in a brief flicker of agony, before it was once again clear. She cleared her throat and shook her head a little.
"But, Edward,"
she trailed off with a cautious expression.
"Edward has had these things too,"
she said quietly as her hand closed into a loose fist. I was taken aback by her now casual mention of him, and pondered briefly how much she actually knew regarding his past. She seemed to have read my expression correctly.
"Carlisle has offered me the abridged version of what he knows,"
she explained without really explaining. It didn't escape my notice that she used that same word Edward had applied to his growing up in Chicago. I was torn between being furious at Dr. Cullen for offering that kind of information to Esme, and feeling relieved that she knew something of his struggles. Esme's face held a light frown.
"He's a troubled boy, I understand that,"
she continued, and then at my defensive expression added,
"No, but I do,"
she persisted, finally moving the hand to grasp mine once more while staring deeply into my eyes.
"It doesn't make him a bad person,"
she insisted as my confusion grew.
"It just makes him a difficult person,"
she clarified, pleading with her eyes while she squeezed my hand.
"It distorts his view of what is right and wrong."
I snatched my hand back angrily. "That's not true. Edward has never been anything but—"
"You are both clinging, Bella,"
she cut me off before I could continue. I snapped my mouth shut, and looked away indignantly as she continued.
"You're both lost and confused, and clinging to each other for help."
Her voice grew desperate once again at my retreat, as she attempted to shift her face into my line of vision.
"But you can't help each other,"
she added, making me impossibly more furious as I once again met her eyes and prepared to prove her wrong. She didn't give me that chance.
"Not if you refuse to help yourselves,"
she concluded with a sad, yet knowing smile. I rolled my eyes and looked away again. She was wrong. Edward helped me plenty, and I helped him. We helped ourselves by helping each other. She couldn't possibly know anything about our dynamic.
"I understand, you don't see that yet, but you will."
She still had that knowingly condescending look on her face. Esme knew all? It was making me quite flustered.
"One day when you're older and your judgment isn't being clouded by your emotions, you'll see that I'm right."
"I'm not a child," I snapped defensively, folding my arms across my chest, and clenching my fists into my sides. "No," she agreed, leaning back in her stool, and eyeing me warily.
So maybe it's time you stop acting like one.
She quirked an eyebrow at me.